Okay, so normally we say good morning, but I think I'll say good afternoon because most of our speaker panel certainly is in the afternoon. So welcome everybody. This is the third and final week of the virtual IFSLR for 2021. We're doing oxygen scleral shape and technology. And this morning's going to be moderated by Dr. Daddy Fidel. Before we get started, we do want to take the opportunity just to give a special thanks to all of our amazing supporters because we've had a lot of support in making this meeting happen. So I'll let Jan thank all of our people.
Yeah, welcome to the IFSLR third and last webinar. And we definitely want to express our gratitude to our generous sponsors. First, I mentioned Bausch & Lomb, represented by Patrick Marsalek, who is Senior Director of the Special Division product, and most likely listening in right here. We also want to express our gratitude to Cooper Vision, Blanchard, and the Cooper Vision person that we dealt with and are grateful to is J.C. Aragon, President of the Specialty Eye Care Division. Today we have Cooper Vision Blanchard represented by Richard Dorer. And like last time, Bausch & Lomb gave a brief statement, and Richard Dorer is now ready to offer a statement by Cooper Vision. Thank you.
And while Richard gets his slides up, I will also say thank you, Melissa, for reminding me to do our weekly tradition of everybody putting in the chat where you're coming from. And I also want to introduce our other moderators. We have Daddy Fidel and Muriel Shornack on here with us today. So with that, though, I will introduce Richard for a few minutes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bergmanson. And I'm very happy to be here. We're very proud to support this program. And I want to thank you for allowing us a couple of moments to speak. My name is Richard Dorer. I'm with Cooper Vision Specialty Eye Care. And this morning, I'd like to go over how to access instrument-driven fitting for our OneFit Med and OneFit Med Plus lenses on our website. The OneFit Med and OneFit Med Plus has total parameter control for the practitioner and complete customization with 4 independent fitting zones. You've got your central zone, your mid-peripheral zone, your limbal zone, and your edge. All of these can be controlled independently by either moving them farther away from the eye or closer to the eye in plus or minus. So you can move your mid-peripheral zone away from the eye, indicated in a plus direction. Plus means moving farther away from the eye, and minus means moving it closer to the eye. We can do these in 25 micron steps to plus or minus 300 microns in either direction. So I don't have a whole lot of time here this morning. So what we want to do is we want to find the tools. So we find the tools at blanchardlab.com, and on the top right of the home screen, we would click Tools and Order Form. That brings up a page that will give you access to any of the online fitting tools that we have for the products that we manufacture. So we're going to go with the OneFit Med Plus and the OneFit Med. We're going to choose Med, excuse me. We're going to choose Med, and we would click on the fitting tool. Once the fitting tool loads into your browser, you would want to click on New Fitting Tool, Profillimetry Assisted Fitting. What this does is this allows you to use, if you have the eaglet, to use your direct connect. If you have the Oculus, you would click on Oculus, and then it would ask you to choose your file. You would have saved your Oculus CSP file, and you go find it, and then you would import it that way. Or if you don't have either of those machines and you have some other scleral profilorimetry, you can come in here and click manual data entry, where you would enter your data. Once you've done that, you would click to choose your file, and it would load it in. It'll load your file in. If your capture was good and everything was successful, if you would like to choose your final lens, the lens will be designed from your final lens, or from your profillimetry right here. Or if you had a fitting set and chose to use your fitting lens, it would recommend a fitting lens for you to use. Now, if you're going to use your projected lens, sometimes it's a little bit more difficult because you got to find the power. Now, if you're going to work with power, what you would use is you'd put another base curve, you'd put a GP lens, or if the patient was wearing a scleral lens, and you would work for that, and it would help you calculate your power. Most of the practitioners that we work with are using a trial lens. This helps them choose their recommended trial lens. And then this is the lens you'd put on. Once you've done that, you can transfer all this information to the fitting tool. Once in line A in the fitting tool, it puts in the trial lens that the calculator suggested. And in line B, you would only add the things that you wanted to change to your trial lens. If your SAG was correct, but you needed to raise or lower your mid-peripheral values, minus being closer to the eye, plus moving it farther away from the eye in microns, and you'd put your over refraction in, and then you would click calculate. Once you've done that, it brings up the idea of what your new lens would look like on the eye. So in this case, on the left-hand side, it brought in all the parameters from your fitting tool. It gives you your parameters to order. It also gives you your primary functional sagittal depth. And on the right side, the black line here represents the lens in situ, the trial lens in this case. And the blue line shows you where your proposed changes would be. This allows you to see what you would like to see on the lens before you actually order it. On the bottom, it shows you your tier lens. If it's green, it's an increase in change, or an increase in your tier lens. And if it's red, it shows you a decrease in your tier lens. So in this case, we had M would be a minus 150 microns. So in the M value, which is 9.5 millimeters in diameter from the central portion of the lens, it shows you would have increased or decreased your tier lens by 150 microns. Your limbal zone, you wanted to increase it in this example by 100 microns, and we raised it 100 microns, and you have 100 microns more clearance. So from there, you can order online or do whatever you'd like. That's our short presentation for this morning. And we would, once again, from Cooper Vision Specialty Eye Care, we're very proud to help support this program and proud to share this information with you. Please feel free to reach out to me at any time. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, we want, before we get started, we want to recognize our partners in education, the Pentavision, GSLS people, particularly Roger Zimmer, Executive Director at Pentavision. We want to also recognize Maureen Trusky, who's chief of everything, fixes everything. And last but not the least, we want to recognize Dr. Jason Nichols, who is the chair of the Education Committee for GSLS, also editor of the Contact Lens Spectrum, and associate vice president at University of Alabama. Thank you, guys.
Okay, and now Daddy is going to get the program started.
So hello everyone, welcome. We have attendees from around the world. This session is truly international, and also our speakers are all international as well. So we will start with Dr. Alejandra Consejo, who is a physicist who earned her PhD in biomedical engineering at Wrocław University of Science and Technology in Poland. She has worked in different research institutions in Spain, Poland, Belgium, and UK. Currently, she is an assistant professor and lecturer for the Department of Applied Physics at the University of Zaragoza in Spain. Then we will have Professor James Wolffsohn, who is a professor of optometry at Aston University since 2000. Formerly was head of optometry and deputy executive dean for life science, and is now associate pro-vice chancellor. Prior to his appointment to Aston University, Professor Wolffsohn was a clinical research fellow at the University of Melbourne in Australia, and his main research areas are the development and evaluation of ophthalmic instrumentations, contact lenses, intraocular lenses, and the tear film. Then Dr. David Pinero is doctor in visual sciences from the University of Alicante in 2010. Degree in optics and optometry from the University of Alicante, obtaining the extraordinary award of the degree in documentation from the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya, and university specialist in pre and post-surgical optometry from the University of Valladolid. He is associate editor of the Journal of Optometry and BMC Ophthalmology and Journal of Ophthalmology. So please join me in welcoming our speakers, and we can start with Dr. Consejo.
Thank you. Okay, thank you for the introduction and for the invitation. Especially, it's an honor to be here presenting my work at the International Forum for Scleral Lens Research. I'm here today to talk about how the scleral shape is related to corneal shape. Okay. The title of my presentation, it's the same title as from a journal paper that we got published last year in Contact Lens and Anterior Eye. So in case you are curious, you always can go to the source material. So, oops. No. Okay, so we all know that the cornea in keratoconus is different from that of control or not diseased eyes. But today, we also know that this not only affects the affected area of the cornea, but also the peripheral cornea and the sclera. We know that the sclera of keratoconic people is different from that of control people. So this is very important information and crucial in the process of contact lens fitting. But I would like to say a few words on the instrumentation that we have available, that we can mostly separate into groups. We have either corneal topography, that we know that it's only able to map the cornea, or we have corneoscleral topography, that it's able to map the cornea and the sclera at the same time. The good thing of the corneoscleral topography is that you can really see the shape of the sclera, but it's not as popular in clinics yet as it is the corneal topography. So here it came our research question. We wonder if it's possible to predict the shape of the sclera if we only have access to corneal data. To reply to this question, we invited 20 keratoconic subjects. We were very careful with the inclusion criteria. These 20 people were not using contact lenses, any kind of contact lenses, and they all had matching axial length, because we know from our previous research that these are confounding factors in scleral shape. So we measure all these people with two different devices, with a corneoscleral topographer, that was the ESP from Eaglet Eye, and a corneal topographer, a pentacam, a traditional pentacam from Oculus. So the data that we extracted from these devices, first from the ESP, from the maps, we took custom-made parameters. With this, I mean that from the 3D maps that the ESP offers, we developed our own routines, and from that we extract these parameters: scleral symmetry, sagittal height, and we found the steepest and flattest regions in the cornea and in the sclera. These are not parameters that are even directly by the software. However, in the pentacam, we did use, let's say, standard parameters, like the numbers that are given by the software, both that account for corneal shape, so the typical case, the curvature, the composition, and also those parameters that are related or more related to keratoconus itself, like the thickness of the cornea, the level of astigmatism, the BADD index, and so on. So the big question was to try to find a correlation between these kind of parameters. If there was a way, knowing one part of the story, if it was possible to infer the other part. So this table is extracted directly from the paper, and here we can see that what we are doing is we are trying to see if there is a correlation between scleral asymmetry and different corneal parameters given by pentacam. What we call scleral asymmetry, it's a parameter that we have created. It gives a number in microns, and to make it easy, if the number is big, that means that the sclera is very irregular. So to speak, that is very bumpy, while a small number would describe a fairly regular spherical sclera. So we found that the scleral asymmetry was very correlated with anterior corneal surface parameters. So not with every corneal parameter, but with anterior corneal surface parameters. However, we did not find a correlation with parameters that were more related to the keratoconus, specific markers of keratoconus, as it can be the posterior radius of curvature, the thinnest thickness of the cornea, or the BADD index. There we did not find a correlation, and that's why it's in red. So here, the first conclusion of this presentation is that if we characterize the anterior corneal surface, we can get an idea of how irregular is the sclera. In other words, the steeper the anterior cornea, the more asymmetric will be the sclera. In the second part of the work of the results, here we have a typical. This is an eye of one of the patients, one of the 20 eyes, and here we have a map extracted from the ESP. Each of these maps, we divide them in 3 different annuli: demarcating the central cornea, the peripheral cornea, and the sclera. Okay, so here what we try to do is try to find where were the steepest and the flattest areas in each of the annuli. That's the cone position. And as you can see, we found a big correlation between the steepest scleral sector and also the steepest corneal sectors. So this means that if you know where is the steepest area of the cornea, you have around an 85% chance of guessing correctly what is the steepest area of the sclera. However, it was not so straightforward with the flattest area of the sclera. We found a much larger variability. There was not a consistent angle. So there was some correlation, but was weaker. We couldn't make such a strong statement. And we found that the flattest area of the sclera tend to really depend on the person. So the second conclusion of the work is that the position of the steepest area is angularly stable, but this does not happen with the flattest area. So coming back to the beginning, can we predict scleral shape only having access to corneal data? The honest and short answer is that for what we know now, no. So if you want to know how is the sclera, you need to measure the sclera. However, the good news is that if you only have access to corneal data, you still can extract from that some information that can be of assistance in the process of contact lens fit, such as having an idea, an estimation of how irregular is going to be the sclera of the patient, and also know where is the steepest area of the sclera. So that's all from my side. Thanks a lot. I would like also to thank all my collaborators in Scleral Lens Research, especially those from Ghent, that is where this, in Belgium, where this the clinical part of this work was done. And that's it. I guess that the questions will be later. I'm very open to questions, so there you have my email, so feel free to email me anything.
Thank you, Dr. Consejo. Yes, we will have the question at the end of the session. Meanwhile, we are switching the sharing screen. Yes, I have just one small comment. We always said that when fitting scleral lenses, corneal topography is not needed. I previously presented some works in which I stated that corneal topography is very important to understand also corneal area of the scleral lens. And I'm very glad that you are showing that corneal topography is also important for the sclera alignment, scleral lens alignment on the conjunctival tissue. So indeed, this is very interesting. I would now ask, okay, Professor James Wolffsohn has already shared his screen. So thank you, Alejandra, and we will ask you at the end. So please.
Lovely, thank you very much to the International Society or International Forum for Scleral Lens Research for inviting me today. Can I acknowledge my research team who are on the slide, and also Contomac for supporting this research. Here are my disclosures, but if we move on to the topic for today, we're going to be looking at how much oxygen permeability a scleral lens really needs. Now, of course, this is not a new issue. People have been concerned about corneal swelling right from the very early days of contact lenses. And there's been modeling to try and understand how much oxygen permeability we need from Michaud's group back in 2012, suggesting that we need a DK of at least 150 for a central thickness of 250 microns and a clearance of 200 microns. Later, Compan looked at it and suggested 125 DK with a 200 central thickness and 150 micron fluid reservoir. Compan looked later and suggested it should be as high as possible. Steve Vincent did some work, and I know he'll be on the panel later, showing for a 100 DK lens for 8 hours where swelling was low, clinically insignificant, perhaps at 1.7% for a 300 micron center thickness. And again, there's been more modeling by Huing Quim, who suggested a DK as low as 25 could give us a thickening of the cornea less than 2%. The problem always with modeling, of course, is that there are many things that we can't model very easily, such as the edge effect. So in this study, we wanted to determine this in vivo for scleral lens daily wear. And so what we did was we took 15 participants, each was fitted with scleral lenses of identical design. And of course, that's really important when we're trying to examine a specific parameter. So they all had a uniform thickness of around 350 microns, a low negative power, a diameter of 15.8, oxygen permeabilities from the materials that we could get hold of between 65 and 200 DK, so a very broad range. It was a double mask randomized study of 8 hours wear with at least 48 hours washout between the lenses, and also then a comparison at the same time of day to no lens wear and also having worn a soft silicon hydrogel for that same 8-hour period. In terms of our participants, they came in between 8 and 10 a.m. in the morning for their baseline measurements and lens insertion, and then returned 8 hours later, so between 4 and 6 in the evening for those repeated measurements. And you can see here the measurements we took, so high resolution OCT for corneal thickness and fluid reservoir depth, corneal curvature and objective bulbar and limbal grading with the ocular keratograph, and then corneal biomechanics with the ORA, and finally comfort with a visual analog score. Needed to check that the lenses really were the thickness that we devised, and they all are within a very small margin. So let's have a look at the results. In terms of baseline measures, so those ones taken in the morning, yes, the 48 hours was enough. They all had very similar baseline measures each morning. So we're just seeing the effect of the lens. All scleral lenses, regardless of their decay, increase the central thickness of the cornea after 8 hours of wear, on average by 0.7%. Notice that with no lens wear, actually that central corneal thickness decreases. So the overall difference was about 1.3%. And in terms of soft lens wear, actually, we saw a further decrease with the silicon hydrogel, and it's been suggested that silicon actually can store oxygen in it, so a decrease to minus 0.9%. Here are those results graphically, and we can see that the 65 DK material actually increased the corneal thickness, more swelling with the 65 DK, but there was no significant difference once you got to the 100 DK across all of the materials. If we look at that fluid reservoir depth, as expected after the initial insertion, we have quite a high fluid reservoir that rapidly decreases to about 174 microns, and that stays the same then during the day, and that wasn't significantly different between the lenses. Although the thickness of the corneal thickness after 8 hours was associated with that initial thickness of the fluid reservoir depth at insertion. So how do we understand this data? Well, if we take our cornea here, the central thickness of that lens was 350 microns. The average fluid reservoir depth was initially 326, but more importantly, it rapidly decreased to 174. We have to presume the decay of water, which from previous studies, different models have used different numbers, anywhere between 83 and 94, but on average from work done with HEMA lenses, it's about 88. And so we can see that if you've got a lens with a decay of less than 88, we can calculate that actually it is the lens that is the rate limiting step of how much oxygen gets to the cornea. And it's important in our modeling that we accept that that rate limiting step, the bottleneck, is going to dictate the rate of oxygen through the whole system rather than an average between the two. So actually it's getting through, if it could, faster through the fluid reservoir, but obviously it's prevented from doing that because it's not getting the oxygen through the lens. However, if we have a decay that's above 88, then actually it can pass fast through the lens. So the rate limiting step now, even with the best possible decay, is due to that fluid reservoir. And that combination in our system with the thicknesses there was a decay of a T over 16.8, obviously not enough to give no swelling, but a small amount of swelling. And that's why we get a flattening off after we get a decay above that about 88 type value. In terms of the other physiology for short-term wear, so single stays wear, then we didn't see any changes in corneal curvature or corneal biomechanics, nor in bulbar redness. So certainly for short-term wear, although we're getting this swelling, it's not affecting other forms of physiology. Interestingly, with comfort, there did seem to be a variable in terms of comfort with the higher decay, and the 200 decay lens was more comfortable than the other lenses we tried. So in conclusion, scleral lens wear with a central increases central thickness with all DK materials. Greater than 100 DK will minimize that swelling, but it is associated with that fluid reservoir depth. And the comfort, interestingly, is improved as we go to the top levels of DK. So that leaves us a very interesting question that we can pick up in the discussion of how low can we go? How low can we go for that fluid reservoir, particularly predicting what it's going to be at the end of the day, but also for the central thickness of our lens. All of this has been published last year in a paper in optometry and vision science. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. James. Wolffsohn is very interesting. So it seems that comfort when wearing scleral lenses is related to the transmissibility and permeability to oxygen.
There does seem to be an element of that, particularly at the top range, yes.
Oh, very interesting. Okay, so we will pass to Dr. David Pinero.
Hello. I'm going to share my screen. Oh, wait a minute. Perfect. We have it. You can see now the screen. Perfect. First of all, I would like to say thank you to the organization of this event for considering my contribution to this interesting forum. I'm going to make an update on corneal scleral topography related or which is important in scleral lens wear. This is the team where with the person that we commonly work in this area. As all of you know, at this moment, there are different technologies available for characterizing the corneal topographic profile, since profilometers to shameful imaging-based tomography. These systems have allowed us to have a better knowledge of corneal topographic peculiarities of the human eye, and also with different type of pathologies or pathological conditions. This type of technologies allows an optimization of contact lens fitting, not only sclerals, which is, we can say, the main focus, also to control and to measure more precisely the sagittal height of the anterior eye to perform more accurate fittings of soft contact lenses. First of all, one question that we have when we use this type of technologies is if they are providing reliable information. Recently, we have published in Contact Lens and Anterior Eye an article about the analysis of the intersection consistency of measurements provided with a profilometer, with a Fourier domain profilometer, which is the eye surface profiler, obtaining excellent consistency for some parameters. It's true that the consistency for best fit spheres adjustments were moderate, with some level of limitations, especially the outer best fit sphere, although the coefficients of variations were always very low and below 5% of variations. Concerning sagittal height measurements for different diameters, from 11 to 15 millimeters, you can see that the level of precision was quite good, with coefficients of variations below 4% or even 3%, but it's true that this variation was increasing with increasing diameter, which is normal because the precision of this type of instruments is going to be more limited in the more peripheral areas that you want to measure. Also, there are other profilometers that have been tested in order to analyze if they provide repeatable measurements. For example, this system, SMAP 3D, has shown to provide also repeatable measurements in terms of scleral toricity and sagittal height values at this diameter, at 60 millimeters, and also they have get a better precision by combining the extraction of measurements in 3 different gazes, not only a straight gaze, obtaining a straight gaze image, but also making a free gaze stitched images. But something that we have to consider and we have to take care is that these technologies are not interchangeable. This is an article that is going to be published, I hope, very soon, which is the comparison between the Pentacam system and the eye surface profiler. As you can see, there is a trend to overestimate the measurement of the sagittal height with the same fluke-based device, with more, we can say, overestimation in the measurement of the temporal sagittal height compared to the nasal sagittal height. We have some theories, some optical theories about how the instrument corrects the distortion of the same fluid image, but this is something that should be tested in the future. This is not the only article providing this type of result. A recent article in Optometry and Vision Science have also confirmed this difference with the same, exactly the same trend that we have obtained about this trend of providing higher measurements of sagittal height of the pentacam system compared to the eye surface profiler. But there is something additional that we want to know for using these technologies for fitting contact lenses. It's not only if these instruments provide reliable measurements, but also what we can find. How is the scleral profile? How is this anterior eye geometry? There are several papers, most of them of the group of Consejo, of the previous speaker, which is an excellent researcher on this area. And we have some ideas about how is the geometry of this structure. For example, we know that the scleral area is a very flat area compared to the limbus and cornea, that we have some measurements if in the tangent angle at limbus with a trend to obtain lower values in the inferior part. The mean difference between temporal and nasal sagittal height increase with the diameter, with an increasing diameter, and also that scleral asymmetry also increases as the diameter of analysis increases, suggesting that logically when we fit large diameter scleral lenses, it's very important then to obtain a good measurement of this area to design a good landing of the scleral lens. Also, we have measured, as Dr. Consejo in keratoconus, obtaining very similar results than those that she has presented. I'm not going to repeat the same, but there are differences with a control or healthy eyes, with a control group of healthy eyes, obtaining higher sagittal heights and more asymmetries that increases with the increase of the diameter. And also there are several studies confirming this finding that has shown Dr. Consejo about the correlation about among some corneal and scleral data, especially some peripheral corneal measurements in keratoconus. Concerning the use for scleral lenses, this is one of the first case reports showing how this type of technologies can help in the fitting of scleral lenses in keratoconus. But this was published several years ago. I remember that we have a keratoconus patients that apparently you can see that it's not very difficult profile. We fit a contact lens. Perfect, good comfortability, but the problem is the lens of the right eye tend to rotate, and we cannot do anything, only increase the toricity of the peripheral area. Finally, when we have this device, we can measure exactly what happens, and we realize that the toricity of this eye was 4 times the toricity of the left eye. Is a very interesting case showing the usefulness of this type of technologies. There are also other studies, as those from my colleague Greg, showing different type of patterns. But as you can see, some patterns with asymmetry being not so rare. They are very common, with around 41% of cases showing these asymmetric patterns requiring more specific, more sophisticated designs of scleral lenses. Remember, the correlation with axial length is also correlated. There are less nasotemporal asymmetry in sagittal height in high myopes than in emmetropes. Even, this is a very interesting article published recently that shows how emmetropes have these differences between nasal and temporal sagittal heights, this asymmetry, which is supposed to be related to the forces created by the insertion of this extraocular muscles, but these forces are changed when the eyeball is elongating, and therefore this asymmetry becomes less relevant, as you can see. And in high myopes, we can find exactly the opposite, this more asymmetry between nasal and temporal areas in the sclera. This is something that we have also observed in one study that we have conducted recently, showing in 64 eyes of 64 patients how there is a correlation, a significant correlation between the axial length and this difference between temporal and nasal sagittal heights for 15 millimeters of diameter and for 30 millimeters of diameter. Finally, I want to confirm that profilometry is also useful for quantifying the mechanical impact of the sclerals on the anterior eye surface. This is an article from the group from Universidade do Minho in Portugal, showing how there is some differences in the nasal, temporal, superior and inferior geometry of the scleral profile, depending on the hours of wearing of the scleral lens, and how this is modified depending on the design of the lens used, and how they can tell you if the lens is appropriate or if the mechanical impact is very important and should be considered a change of this design. In conclusion, profilometers and same fluid image-based systems are useful for characterizing the anterior eye shape, but they cannot be used interchangeably. Peculiarities of corneal scleral profile should be considered when fitting scleral contact lenses. Anterior eye shape and axial length are correlated, and therefore, this is something that should be investigated. We are doing now. This type of analysis may be useful for monitoring myopia progression, could be some type of biomarker. And profilometers are also useful to monitor the mechanical impact on conjunctiva of scleral lenses during their wear. I hope you have enjoyed my presentation. Thank you very much. And this is my email for any contact or questions that you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pinero. Very interesting, especially interesting the relationship between axial length and the scleral asymmetry. So do you think that in more myopes, we should go directly to have a more quadrant-specific design or customized scleral lens to have much better success and more lenses ordered?
I don't think so, because what is telling this type of analysis is the difference between nasal and temporal areas is less relevant in high myopes. It's close to zero. The question is that in the more peripheral area, probably you have some, we can say, more arbitrary asymmetries that we cannot control, and probably it's good to use a quadrant specific design, but the data is telling more or less the opposite, and this is something that should investigate more in the future.
Okay, very interesting. So we have some questions for Professor Wolffsohn. Was tear exchange under the lens looked at after 8 hours in your study?
In terms of an analysis of the volume, for example, not specifically. So this was a normal day's wear for the patients, but we didn't analyze the fluid underneath the lens.
Okay. Another question. Okay, so could comfort be related to lens surface characteristic of high DK materials, and also comfort may be related to increased flexibility of high DK contact lenses materials?
Yeah, it certainly, of course, could be related to the surface, and we have done studies looking at the surface, not of scleral lenses, but of other lenses, RGPs, for example, and and we know with poor wetting materials you can make a big difference. With your better materials, you generally can't make huge amounts of difference, and these weren't patients who were uncomfortable in lens wear generally. So we don't think it was too much to do with that, although of course we can't tease that out. But we do know, we did a paper back in 2004, Claire O'Donnell and myself, looking at swelling, and we, in those mad cut days, we made my cornea swell by fitting a very low decay material, and then watched it recover. And while we could track the recovery in corneal thickness, and it had totally recovered by 160 minutes, actually, if you looked at the transparency of the cornea, it still hadn't recovered over that time. So this measure that we have of corneal edema, while it's good for more intense deprivation of oxygen, it doesn't necessarily tell us the whole story. So while a 100 DK lens or above seems to not have extra effect over the fluid reservoir, perhaps higher DK is still useful on those more subtle changes. And you need to remember that our studies and other people's studies have only really looked over a short period of time. So in our case, 1 day of 8 hours wear, we don't know what happens after a week, after a month, after a year, where more subtle differences might show.
Yeah, indeed, more details. We need more research. We need in this area. I would ask Steve, who did the study on corneal edema with fluid reservoir thickness up to 700, about 700 initial fluid reservoir thickness. So, do you have anything to comment, Steve, on this?
Yeah, I mean, our work in edema has basically found what James's study has found as well, in that as the fluid reservoir increases, you do have an increase in edema, perhaps not quite as much as predicted by some of the models, but in follow-up studies, which we haven't published yet, where we've looked at increasing the thickness of the lens quite substantially, up to more than 1,000 microns, we don't get anywhere near as much edema as we do compared to when we increase the fluid reservoir. So I think James is on the right path there, that the how much clearance you have is really the limiting factor rather than the thickness of the lens, as long as you're using a high DK material.
Okay. Another questions. Can you please explain the correlation between scleral irregularity and corneal topography with examples? I think that is addressed to Dr. Consejo and Dr. Pinero.
Okay. Okay, so if I may reply to that one, I would say, okay, correlation between scleral irregularity and corneal topography. Okay, so if you have access to anterior corneal data, then you can assess how irregular is the cornea. So if it's very, the sclera, sorry. But with examples, I don't have, so I don't have pictures that I could show now. But the idea is that the cornea can be of assistance to know the shape of the sclera, but if you really need to know where is a given irregularity in a sclera, you need to pressure the sclera. What we know for now is that just knowing the cornea, there's no way, or we have not found a way to really predict the shape of the sclera, because yeah, it's highly dependent on the person. So we can use the cornea as an assistance, but not as a super predictor, let's say.
Possibly people is asking, I don't know, if there is one parameter that we can use from corneal topography to say, oh, if this number is higher, we have to put a toric scleral lens or something like this. But this is, I think Dr. Consejo agrees, is is impossible. It's very variable. We have some cues about how is going to be the sclera, but not with this precision. I think it's very difficult.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, another question for you too, Dr. Pinero and Dr. Consejo. With more research, do you think that it will be possible to predict axial length on the basis of scleral topography?
We have finished an article that probably we will submit next week about this. I can tell you that we can make some predictions of axial length, but they are not, we can say, reliable enough for the extreme cases. If we have highly myopes or hyperopes, there are outliers, important outliers, but possibly we can make some level of estimation for as an additional data, but they should be analyzed if you want to make research, or if you want to use this data for more careful analysis. You need to measure directly this axial length. But it's curious that when you have a very, I cannot say one number, but when you have long axial lengths, there are several numbers for which the difference between nasal and temporal sagittal height is practically zero. Therefore, it's very difficult to make the prediction because there is an overlapping of data with the same number, and it's complicated.
Yeah, I think, okay, in the work that we did, we found around 70% correlation between the axial length and the
same.
But the issue is that I think the beauty of this is that we need to, because these are already myopes, but the nice thing would be, we don't know, like what was first, how is this, the chicken or the egg, right? So maybe we don't know if someone has already a given sclera, and that way that person will develop myopia. So the nice thing would be if we could really measure myopia in the onset and see if it's the sclera changing or what's happening there. So if somehow how the whole shape of the eye is changing from the beginning, because I think that the research that we have done so far is people, so only in one point of time, we have not followed those people. And I think that would be the next step in this line of research, really progression and study, follow people.
I think I completely agree with Dr. Consejo. I think that probably in the future it's not so important to make probably these predictions that I agree is around 70%, 68%, 70% the degree of correlation. But I have measured a lot of hyperopes, and we have seen that in hyperopes this prediction fails a little bit, and this is the problem. I think the good question, and Alejandra Consejo has said something very important, is to find some, we can say, biomarkers or predictors to control since the initial state of the myopia. And that can be some ways of controlling that something is happening in this sclera, and we can suspect that the myopia is progression or something is occurring. But this needs more research. But I think we are in the line.
Yeah.
Okay, so I would have a question to Professor Wolffsohn, Professor Vincent, and also Eve van der Wal. Is there a way to calculate the decay needed when the lens is lens thickness is greater than 350 microns? So practitioner may know when to increase the decay if the lens is thicker.
So with a thicker lens, it's not, as long as you've got a high decay, it is not the rate limiting step. So when you're modeling decay and it passing through the lens and the fluid reservoir, one of those elements is going to be the rate limiting step that's going to slow everything else down. So take it like your Wi-Fi. If you've got really good Wi-Fi coming to your house, but really slow Wi-Fi within your house, then obviously you're going to get slow Wi-Fi. But swap that round the other way. So you've got really slow Wi-Fi coming to your house. Even if you've got a fantastic router, you're still going to get slow Wi-Fi. So the rate limiting step that we've got is we now have materials that have wonderful decays. They're not the ones that are causing this edema. The edema is coming from that fluid reservoir. So it then comes down to, well, actually, how low can we make that fluid reservoir? We know it's going to settle during the day. It settles quite quickly from the research we have. So can we get better predictors of what kind of fluid reservoir we need initially to mean we can have the absolutely lowest possible fluid reservoir during the rest of the day? Is that a predictable value? And how low can we go before we get other adverse effects?
If I may quickly jump in on that. So with that reduction of clearance, almost everything that we can think of sort of shouts out for reducing that amount of liquid fluid, fogging and oxygen and many others. From a clinical perspective, I just want to throw in to be very careful with that too, especially if you have a compromised cornea, a PK, intracorneal rings or something. So especially if you're a beginner, be very careful of that sinking or settling that James was talking about, because you do not want the back surface of that lens to get in contact with that cornea, compromised cornea especially, because you will end up with a compromised cornea or a hazy cornea or whatever. So that is just something to keep in the back of our mind while we are settling everything that we talked about. And congrats to all of you for the fantastic research that you're doing. One question for James, if I may. Do you have any explanation for the potential better comfort with the really high decay materials? Is there anything you can think that could cause that?
Yeah, so the only thing I can think of, I mean, as someone said earlier in the question, you know, it could be about the surface of the material. Our understanding is that 200 DK material doesn't have a fantastically better surface than the other materials. If anything, it might be the other converse. So that's probably not a factor, although that is something we could now test with coating all of those lenses. So I suspect it is something to do with edema tells us so much about swelling, but I think that there are other factors there. So even if you're not seeing corneal swelling, it is potential that the physiology is to a certain extent compromised. And it's possible that comfort can pick that up a little bit more. That's something, though, that has to be explored more with research.
Maybe we need to look at the peer inflammatory mediators or something like that along with that.
Yep, no, that's absolutely right.
So we always say
Yeah,
that. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I just want to remind everybody of the fact that Dwight Kavanagh and Patrick Ladasher, in their experiments on corneal epithelial regeneration, when they put the most physiological lens on that gave the cornea everything it needed, they still had a reduction in epithelial mitosis. So just the presence of a lens will change something. And I think that's what James hinted at. And that's what you have found, has been found studying other things.
Okay. Related to, could it be that with the higher decay, is there more silicon content in the polymer, that the resulting lens is somewhat softer and leads to slight more comfort, lens awareness?
Yes, there's probably a little bit more silicon, although there's other chemistry involved with it. It doesn't really explain generally if we have more silicon in a lens, you're probably going to have a less wettable lens and therefore more uncomfortable, not more comfortable. So that sort of acts in a counterintuitive way, which is why I don't think it's so much about surface properties. In this case, I do think it's probably more about subtle physiology, as Jan spoke about. But it is an area for future research.
Okay, so we know how to reduce the influence of the tear exchange on oxygen transfer. We know that the looser fit will promote tear exchange, so we'll let more oxygenated tear into the fluid reservoir. Do you have another way to decrease this influence of the tear exchange on oxygen transfer?
Yeah, so as we've said, the other way is obviously having less fluid there in the first place. Obviously, tear exchange is good. Generally, most studies show that there is very limited tear exchange under a scleral lens. Yes, you can try and make it looser, but it's settling into the cornea. Even if it's looser to begin with, you're probably not going to impact the amount of tear exchange enormously. So then really that challenge is reducing that fluid reservoir. But as Aoife said, you've got to be ultra careful, particularly with compromised eyes, that you then don't come in contact with the cornea. So that's probably where our specialism needs to increase in trying to predict this in normal eyes, and maybe a closer monitoring when we fit compromised corneas initially, and an acceptance that we may have to fit several different lenses using some advanced techniques to alter the fluid reservoir depth. And remember, of course, we're talking across the lens. So while we're looking generally here at central corneal thickness, the thickness of the lens and the thickness of the fluid reservoir in the periphery is generally less. So that's going to have less of an effect. But with a compromised eye, that's going to vary over the profile of the lens quite significantly.
Okay.
I think it's
To promote the fluid reservoir, the tear exchange, we have channels and fenestrations. Eve?
Yeah, I was just going to say, but I think Muriel has something to say as well. But I just want to say that with standard lenses as we know them, I doubt if there's any clinical significant tear film exchange. So I don't think that is something to focus on. It's got to be the material and the clearance that are our variables. Having said that, again, trying to put things a little bit into clinical context, I think only if we have a corneal transplant in clinical practice, we see really significant problems with oxygen. Then those are the really challenging eyes. In non-corneal transplants, usually it's not a huge problem. One of the, I would say, the relevance of the whole hypoxia story is, of course, whether microorganisms can adhere to the cornea and cause corneal infections, MKs. So that is certainly one of the consideration. Having said that, if you want to prevent corneal infections, I think the whole hygiene and the care system thing is probably, well, as important or maybe even more important, if you ask me, than the whole oxygen discussion. So again, just trying to put things a little bit in perspective and bringing it down to the practice, while of course we got to figure all this out. And again, kudos to all the fantastic work that you're doing in that arena.
Definitely, you are right. This is an issue when we have endothelium corneal abnormalities such as in transplants and Fuchs dystrophy. Definitely. Thank you for pointing this. And we have one last question. When you are measuring the scleral lens thickness regarding oxygen permeability, are you taking the central thickness only or the overall lens thickness?
So what I presented today was the center thickness, but in the paper we do model it in terms of the thickness profile over the lens and the range of decay that you get as a result. But again, we're having to make assumptions, and normally we look for the worst case scenario, which in this case is going to be center.
Okay, wonderful. So we have, we went over the time. Thank you everyone for this discussion, for presenting your research. Everyone was very interesting. Maria, I will let you.
Yeah, and I think thank you so much for moderating and this great session. You know, as usual, we don't have enough time to continue the discussions as we would like to, but I do want to thank everyone so much for making the virtual manifestation of this program, really such a success. You can view the recorded sessions on the Scleral Lens website and also on the GPL or GSLS emails that you'll get. So you'll get an email and you can just view these like you view any other of the GSLS recordings. And we hope that we will see you live next year. And thank you again for the great attendance. All right, that's it. Have a great day, everyone, or night, evening, wherever you are.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.